Hello Green Wave Festival. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the festival. I'm really excited to be joining in. I'm also really glad that you're focusing on fantasy writing this year. You framed this discussion in such a fascinating way that fantasy is bigger than us. And my first thought was that, of course, I agree with that. I mean, after all, what makes fantasy so wonderful is its scope. Time travel, magic, fantastical creatures, incredible adventures. And that's why we love reading fantasy stories so much. But then I started to think about my own fantasy writing and also about some of my favourite fantasy authors, particularly those writing for children. And I think I have to argue that at the same time, fantasy is actually smaller than us because it's part of us. For me, fantasy is a means to investigate reality, especially the reality of our own lives. So much of my own writing is based around my personality. Children often ask me at events whether my characters are inspired by real people, and I always hesitate over answering. My characters are rarely borrowed directly from life. Mostly, they're hundreds of tiny pieces stitched together, words overheard, a face remembered, just a twist of personality. But so many of them have parts of me inside. And I think it's impossible to avoid this. I spend such a long time trying to make my characters feel real, to act as a real person would, to be believable. And of course, I'm thinking about how they'll react, and that will always be affected by my own feelings and my own experience. One rather silly but still meaningful example is that I've never been able to write a friendly spider into a story. I'm terrified of spiders. I know that it's not at all logical, and I'm really ashamed of it. I can just about manage to take a spider out of the house if I have to, given time and the right equipment. But if I see a large spider unexpectedly, I scream and I run. And all my characters are frightened of spiders. The one or two who aren't seem to me to be rather hard-hearted or unsympathetic. The most obvious trait that's represented in my books is a deep and lasting love of animals. My work divides reasonably equally between books just about animals and books that are about animals and magic. And ever since I was a very small child, I've wanted to understand animals better. My most well-known books are a series of stories about puppies and kittens, and although they don't contain any magic and wouldn't usually be regarded as fantasy stories at all, they are fantasy for me in a way, as they're written partly from the view of a child character and partly from the point of view of an animal. And this is fantastical. I'm creating a world where animals can communicate and sharing that world with others. Part of the aim for that series of books has always been to help children consider the lives and well-being of animals in the hope that it will affect the way they treat the animals in their own lives. Even if this just means rescuing the spiders they find so frightening rather than squashing them. So, if my characters and stories are so much affected by my own real world life, how can I write books about impossible things? I would say that all fantasy is in some ways wish fulfillment. And for me particularly, that's the ability of so many of my fantasy characters to talk directly to animals. That was the main premise of my first set of fantasy books, Animal Magic. The idea for these books came to me when I was still working as an editor at a children's publisher in London. I was walking down the corridor to make a cup of coffee when an image came into my head of an old-fashioned shop with animal cages stacked up the walls. Whenever someone entered the shop, there would be a great listening silence, as the animals in the cages decided whether or not it was safe to talk, whether they could trust the person who'd walked into the shop not to betray them. The whole series of 7 books started from that moment, from that idea. It even came before I thought about Lottie, the main character. So, fantasy for me has to be partly a desire to know one's own self better, or to understand one's own motivation. If a character has magical powers or incredible abilities, those powers must relate to the author's own secret desires, surely. Though I'm not always sure whether the author realises this at the time, and I certainly don't. However, I also find fantasy much more satisfying when it's deeply rooted in reality. A few years ago, I wrote a series of books about a girl called Emily Feather. She was an adopted child, although she didn't know this at the start of the first book. And the family that she'd been adopted into were fairies. I grew up reading fairy tales and loving them. One of my favourite books was by Enid Blyton, an author who's seen as problematic in some ways today, but in the 1980s, her books were still much loved and very popular. It was called Enid Blyton's Book of Brownies, and it was a book of short stories about different sorts of fairy characters. I adored it, especially because most of the stories were explanations, why toadstools were called toadstools, and why fern leaves curl up at the ends. I'd wanted to write a proper fairy book for ages. But the problem for Emily Feather is that when she discovers her family are fairies, she also discovers that she is not. She doesn't belong, and she has no magic inside her. Throughout the series, Emily discovers more about her own history, and she realises that she does actually have magical powers, although they're very different to her family's fairy magic. Her magic is to do with her love and care for her adopted family, and it's expressed through cooking. I've always found cooking to be a magical process, particularly baking. I love cooking, and I adored writing about Emily's baking magic. It seemed so right that magic spells would be recipes. Fantasy is such an important part of our emotional life, in terms of our dreams, our wishes, even sometimes our self-deception. Many of my books are set entirely in the real world, and yet they still contain a deep fantasy element. Children tell stories to themselves. This is something that I've always done. I was a very shy child, and sometimes I found it difficult to talk to other people. I was particularly bad at standing up for myself. I would simply shut down. However, after the event, I always knew exactly what I should have said. I would tell myself over and over the way I wished the day had gone, not in order to believe that it really had happened that way, but just for comfort. This was my first storytelling, and it's something that seeps into so many of my characters. My book, A Tiger Tale, is about a child named Kate, whose grandfather has recently died. In fact, the story starts with family and friends gathering after his funeral. Kate is devastated by her loss, and she clings to Amos, the toy tiger that Grandad gave her. Throughout the book, Kate convinces herself that Amos is real, that he can become a real massive tiger, and that somehow Grandad has sent the tiger to care for her, or perhaps that the tiger even is her grandfather. She's lonely and frightened, and she feels that no one else in her family misses her grandfather the way that she does. Deep down, she knows that Amos is a toy, but she spins a great dream world around him that she wants to believe in so very much. Sometimes real life is hard, and fantasy is what we need to keep us going, never more so than at the moment. But this isn't to say that fantasy is the lighter alternative, or that we're not engaging with reality in our reading and our writing. By creating and investigating fantasy worlds, we're examining our own lives, and we're always going to reflect our own world. I started plotting a new book a few months back, just as COVID-19 started to be in the news, and I found myself wondering how a community of wild animals living along a riverbank would deal with a terrible sickness. Surely, creating different lives and different worlds must force us to think about how we make our own world better. Fantasy is bigger than us. When we dream up fantasy stories, they'll always be wilder and more wonderful than real life. But it's in their ties to reality that they're truly magical. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.